Ethical decision making and counseling. Hello, everyone. My name is Cassandra Lewis, and this presentation will examine an ethical dilemma in counseling using the ethical decision making model from the Practitioner's Guide for Ethical Decision Making, developed by Forrester Miller and Davis. The purpose of this presentation is to analyze a counseling scenario involving multicultural concerns within the therapeutic relationship. I will walk through each step of the ethical decision making process while applying the ACA Code of Ethics, relevant state and federal laws, and the class textbook by Remley and Harley, Ethical, Legal, and Professional Issues in Counseling to determine an ethical course of action. The ethical dilemma. The ethical dilemma in this case involves a client who came in showing symptoms of anxiety, depression, and isolation. The client reported feeling dismissed by family members and described experiencing stigmas around mental health within her cultural community. During the counseling session, the client asked the counselor whether a white counselor could fully understand the lived experiences of a Black woman. This question introduced concerns concerning cultural identity, trust in the counseling relationship, and the counselor's ability to provide culturally responsive care. This situation represents a common ethical challenge in the counseling practice because it involves multicultural awareness, the development of the therapeutic alliance, and the counselor's responsibility to respond ethically and professionally to the client's concerns. Research shows that cultural responsiveness within the counseling relationship plays a significant role in developing trust and improving counseling outcomes. Lee et al. 2024. Identifying the problem. The first step in ethical decision-making process is to clearly identify the problem. The main problem in this scenario is that the client is unsure whether the counselor can fully understand her cultural experiences due to racial and cultural differences. This concern affects the client's sense of safety and trust within the counseling relationship. There are several secondary problems present. These include the cultural stigma surrounding mental health that the client described, concerns about counselor competence in multicultural counseling, and the potential impact on the therapeutic alliance if the client feels misunderstood. This situation also includes multiple dimensions. From an ethical perspective, the counselor must demonstrate cultural sensitivity and respect for the client's autonomy. From a professional perspective, the counselor must practice within the boundaries of competence. From a clinical perspective, the client's symptoms of anxiety and depression may be affected by whether she feels understood in therapy. Standards and state laws. The second step in the ethical decision-making process involves identifying the relevant ethical standards and legal codes. Two sections of the ACA Code of Ethics are particularly relevant to this scenario. First, Standard A2C, Developmental and Cultural Sensitivity, states that counselors should communicate in ways that recognize and respect clients' cultural identities and lived experiences. Second, Standard C2A, Boundaries of Competence, requires counselors to practice within the limits of their professional competence and seek consultation or referral when appropriate. In addition to ethical standards, legal requirements must also be considered. In Michigan, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act of 1976 prohibits discrimination in public service, including mental health care. Federal law is also relevant. The HIPAA privacy rule enforced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services establishes national standards for protecting client confidentiality and personal health information. These ethical and legal guidelines reinforce the counselor's responsibility to provide culturally respectful and non-discriminatory care. The next step involves examining the moral principles and broader dimensions of the ethical dilemma. Several ethical principles apply in this situation. The principle of autonomy emphasizes the client's right to make decisions about her treatment and whether she wishes to continue working with the counselor. Non-malfeasance requires the counselor to avoid causing harm, including harm that could occur if the client's cultural experiences are dismissed or minimized. The principle of justice involves providing fair and equitable care while recognizing the impact of cultural identity on the counseling relationship. Finally, the principle of fidelity involves maintaining trust and honesty within the therapeutic relationship. According to Hemley and Hurley 2024, these ethical principles provide an important framework for evaluating ethical dilemmas in counseling practices. Research also highlights the importance of cultural humility in counseling relationships. For example, studies have found that culturally responsive counseling improves therapeutic alliance and treatment outcomes for diverse clients. Bayer et al. 2025, Orlovsky et al. 2025 as well. Recent research highlights the importance of cultural humility in counseling relationships. For example, studies have found that culturally responsive counseling improves therapeutic alliance and treatment outcomes for diverse clients. Consultation is an important component of ethical decision making. In this situation, the counselor should consult with an experienced licensed counselor, clinical supervisor, or professional counseling organization to ensure the response to the client's concerns is both ethical and culturally responsive. Courses of action. The next step is identifying all possible courses of action that could address the ethical dilemma. One possible course of action is to avoid discussing the cultural concern and continue therapy as usual. Another option would be to immediately refer the client to another counselor who shares her racial or cultural background. A third option would be to address the client's concerns directly by acknowledging her experiences and engaging in open dialogue about cultural identity within the counseling process. The counselor could seek supervision or consultation to ensure that the situation is handled ethically and professionally. Each of these options must be evaluated carefully before determining the most appropriate response. The next step involves examining the potential consequences of each possible course of action. If the counselor avoids discussing the cultural concern, the client may feel that her experiences are being dismissed. This could weaken the therapeutic alliance and reduce the effectiveness of counseling. If the counselor immediately refers the client to another provider, the client may feel that her concerns are valid, but may also experience frustration about having to start over with a new counselor. If the counselor addresses the client's concerns directly and demonstrates cultural humility, the client may feel heard and respected, which could strengthen trust in the counseling relationship. Seeking consultation can also help the counselor respond more thoughtfully and ensure that ethical and cultural considerations are being addressed appropriately. Evaluating the possible options and their consequences, the most appropriate course of action is to address the client's concerns directly while demonstrating cultural humility and openness. This approach involves acknowledging the client's experiences, inviting continued discussions about cultural identity, and ensuring that the counseling process remains collaborative by doing weekly check-ins to ask the client how comfortable she feels in the counseling process. Research supports this approach. A recent study by Ratashvan in 2024 showed that cultural humility strengthens therapeutic alliance and improves engagement in counseling relationships. By responding this way, the counselor supports client autonomy while also promoting trust and understanding within the counseling relationship. Step 6 would be to evaluate the chosen course of action using 3 ethical tests. The justice test asks whether the decision treats all individuals fairly and equitable. In this situation, addressing the client's concerns respectfully supports this test by providing equitable and culturally responsive care. The publicity test asks whether the counselor would feel comfortable if the decision were publicly known or reviewed by professional peers. Responding with openness and cultural humility would likely be viewed as ethical and responsible decision. The universality test asks whether the decision would be appropriate if all counselors acted in the same way, encouraging culturally responsive dialogue within counseling relationships would be considered a positive professional practice. What does the Bible say? From a Christian viewpoint, it would emphasize humility and respect for others. Philippians 2 verses 3 through 4 encourages the believers to act with humility and to value others above themselves. This principle aligns closely with the counseling concept of cultural humility, where counselors remain open to learning from clients and respecting their lived experiences. Consultation is also supported by biblical wisdom. In Proverbs 11 verse 14, it teaches that safety comes from an abundance of counselors. In ethical counseling practice, seeking consultation helps ensure decisions are thoughtful, accountable, and in the best interest of the client. Scripture also highlights the importance of listening with humility. James chapter 1 verse 19 reminds us to be quick to listen and slow to speak. In counseling practice, this principle supports culturally responsive care, where counselors listen carefully to clients' experiences before offering interpretations or interventions. Finally, we must implement the chosen course of action. First, the counselor will acknowledge and validate the client's concerns about cultural understanding. Then the counselor would invite ongoing dialogue about how the client's cultural identity influences her experiences and expectations within therapy. The counselor would engage in continued self-reflection and professional development to strengthen multicultural competence. Consultation with supervisors or experienced counselors may be used to ensure ethical decision-making. And finally, if the client decides that she would prefer working with a different counselor, the counselor would provide a supportive referral to ensure continuity of care. In conclusion, this case highlights the importance of using structured, ethical decision-making process when responding to complex counseling dilemmas. By applying the Practitioner's Guide for Ethical Decision-Making, I was able to systematically identify the problem, examine relevant ethical standards and legal considerations, evaluate possible actions, and determine the most appropriate course of action. This scenario also underscores the importance of cultural humility in counseling practice. When counselors acknowledge clients' lived experiences and remain open to learning from them, it strengthens trust within the therapeutic relationship. Research supports this perspective, demonstrating that culturally responsive counseling improves both therapeutic alliance and counseling outcomes. Bayer et al. 2025, Orlowski et al. 2025. In addition, ethical practices requires ongoing consultation, reflection, and adherence to professional standards, including the ACA Code of Ethics, as well as relevant state and federal laws. From a Christian worldview, counselors are also called to approach others with compassion, humility, and gentleness and patience. As Colossians 3:12 reminds believers to clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. These qualities help create safe and respectful therapeutic relationships. As a woman of color who has personally sat in the client's seat, I understand the vulnerability and uncertainty that can come with seeking help, especially when questions of cultural understanding arise. That experience deepens my commitment to practicing counseling with humility, empathy, and cultural awareness. Ultimately, the counselor's responsibility is to prioritize client welfare while maintaining ethical, culturally responsive, and legal sound practice. Through open communication, humility, and genuine respect for the client's lived experiences, counselors can build strength, trust, and therapeutic relationship and support, meaningful growth and healing. Thank you.